Hello, how's everybody doing? Welcome to another episode of AWS She Builds Tech Skills North America. I'm Candace Bohannon, and I'm joined today by Han Tran. Excited to be on another show with you. I really like getting to do these shows with you because you have such an interesting job getting to work with nonprofits. It just seems very exciting, and I love the fact that you're working with people who are really giving back. So thanks so much for being here on the show, and yeah, I'm excited to be here.
Yeah, thanks, Candace. I'm excited to be back. We have a really good episode today with highlighting Mercy Corps. Um, and Mercy Corps is an organization that really is a global team of humanitarians working together on the front lines. And they're really tackling today's biggest crisis in terms of, really looking at poverty, trying to change the world in a lot of different ways. But yeah, we have a great episode for you all. And I'm really excited to highlight that.
Yeah, I can't wait to see it. I posted on LinkedIn earlier, just kind of excited about these places where we're actually like giving back. And Han, like you were so lucky that you get to work with these people all the time. So I just think it's really cool. For those of you on the call, like watching us right now, let us know if you have a favorite, a favorite good big initiative that you like to talk about, or maybe a favorite nonprofit that you work with on a daily basis. These sort of things are really interesting for me to learn about and get going that way too. So yeah. So what as we kind of kick things off, is there anything else that you want to like preface and talk through before we dive more into Mercy Corps?
Yeah. So as I kind of was alluding to before, Mercy Corps, like I said, their mission is to really is really a global humanitarian aid group that really provides aid, develops long-term solutions for people across the globe who are really experiencing crises like poverty and climate change. And one thing I would do want to highlight is that some of the nonprofits that our team works with, they have really large missions like this, like climate change and poverty. And a lot of times they come to us and say how do we tackle this, because poverty is such a huge thing to even try to tackle. And it's kind of the same story I give to a lot of my nonprofit customers, is that you really have to start small. And at AWS and at Amazon specifically, we like to talk about something called working backwards, right? So many complex and social environmental issues can really overwhelm you to start with. So I like to tell my customers to start working backwards from your desired long-term impacts. So really identify a small proof of concept. Let's say for this case, you want to look at, helping solve poverty. Great. Well, what is one small impact that you can actually start looking at for a proof of concept? Break that down, and then perhaps we can look at how to scale that in the future. But really starting with that proof of concept, really looking at that end goal and working backwards from there is what we highlighted in this episode with Alicia Morrison. So that's the only thing I do want to just tell the audience here that we are doing before we start showing you all this episode.
Excellent. And also posted Alicia's LinkedIn here if you want to follow her and kind of catch up with her and see more of what she's doing in the world. If you have any comments, questions, suggestions as we're going through the show, definitely post those in the chat. We're always happy to see those. So I guess that's all. Do you want to go ahead and play the interview?
Absolutely. Let's go off camera and I'll play the interview.
Sounds good.
My name is Han Tran, and I am a senior solutions architect here with AWS and part of the She Builds program. Today, we have another special guest on the line with us here, Alicia Morrison from Mercy Corps. Alicia, thank you so much for joining us today. Please introduce yourself. Who do we have the pleasure of speaking to?
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. So my name is Alicia Morrison, and I am the Director of Data Science in the Technology for Development team at Mercy Corps. So I had a bit of a oblique journey into data science and into technology, but I started out in 2007. I finished college and I didn't know what I was going to do, and I joined the Army. So I was in the United States Army on active duty for almost 9 years. And during that time, I did a lot of work with the U.S. Department of State, the U.S. Agency for International Development, the UN. And so when I got out of the military, I went to graduate school, and I thought I wanted to study environmental science and policy. And so I went to the Indiana University and had a great time over the course of 2.5 years studying environmental science and policy. But during that time, I actually took a course in aquatic chemistry, and just got really hyped by the idea of like how mathematical modeling works. And so I sort of leaned into that, and there was a concentration available in environmental systems analysis and modeling. And so I started doing a lot of sort of data work and like looking at systems modeling, and kind of just leaned into that. And then when I was graduating grad school, my partner had a job lined up overseas, and I knew that something like data science was going to have a much more sort of flexible location and remote work sort of availability. And so I went out looking for data science jobs, and it turned out that Mercy Corps needed somebody who was both familiar with aid and development, but also knew something about data science and technology. And so in 2020, in June of 2020, everybody was locked down, and I started at Mercy Corps. So yeah, it's been a wild ride. So I've been at Mercy Corps since June of 2020. And actually, 2020 is when Mercy Corps started our partnership with AWS. And so that's when we first started working with AWS, sort of tools and services. And yeah.
Have you worked with AWS prior to Mercy Corps, or was this your first job that you had that you were working with AWS in the cloud?
Yeah, so this was kind of the first time. I had sort of a general familiarity with it, but it was a steep learning curve. So there was a lot of watching videos and YouTubing and learning how the cloud works and how organizations could leverage the cloud. And really what we were kind of focused on was, how do we bring Mercy Corps as an organization like more into the use of quantitative information and data, and using data science methodologies, given the amount of data that's available to us out in the world. And so it was a lot of focus on what are the cool things we can do with data science, but also what are the foundations we need to set as an organization in order to get there. And so part of it was also setting my own foundations and learning how all those things work. But the fortunate thing is the technology world, I think, is sort of a learning culture, right? Tech moves fast, and you can be the best data scientist or the best developer in the world.
Yeah.
But like, tech is going to change, and you got to learn the next thing. And so it wasn't that hard to kind of get geared up and start to learn what's going on. And anyways, AWS changes every week. There's a new feature or a new thing. So, you know, it's a continuous process.
Absolutely. Yeah. Okay. So changing gears here, tell me more about Mercy Corps for the audience who really doesn't know your mission and who you are. Tell us a little bit more about Mercy Corps.
Yeah, so Mercy Corps is an international humanitarian organization, and our mission is to alleviate poverty, suffering, and oppression, and help people build secure, productive, and just communities. So we do work in more than 40 countries worldwide. In 2022, we reached over 38 million people with our programming. 2023 count is coming. And we're committed to really like creating change through localization, right? The vast majority of the folks that work for Mercy Corps are actually local to the countries where they're working. And so we implement programs across these countries, but we also try to engage communities to create change within their own environments. So Mercy Corps really focuses on 4 main outcome areas, and you can see them here. It ranges from water security and climate to economic opportunity, food security, peace, and good governance. But those things can also include like lots of different components. So food security, we might have agricultural programming. How do we help agricultural systems be more robust, more resilient to climate change? How do we help make sure that farmers are able to plant? How do we sort of think about the interaction between agricultural production and peace and good governance, right, and conflict? And so while these are sort of the four broad areas, Mercy Corps has just a huge array of programming across those four areas, and in 40 countries worldwide.
Yeah. So actually, just to double click on that, you said you are all in 40 plus countries, and so if actually you can go back to the previous slide there. So water security and climate resilience, food security, all that, all these four pillars. You have people in each country working on all four of these pillars.
Yes, I mean, in some cases, it might be a stronger focus on one thing or the other. Broadly, Mercy Corps works across these four pillars. In each individual country, you may have one thing or another, or you may have all four. It depends on sort of like how large our portfolio is in that country. In some countries, we have just one or two programs. In other countries, we may have huge multi-million-dollar programs over the course of 5 to 10 years, right, that have been funded for that long. So it really just depends. And also we have things called complex programs, where an individual program can address multiple sectors and multiple outcome areas as well. So yeah, it gets complicated.
Yeah, 40 countries, I feel like laws and regulations, it's really hard to keep track of what's going on, right? So curiosity, how do you all manage that today?
Yeah, well, we work long hours. No, I mean, I think one of the things is that I would say that we are still figuring it out. And I think we are going to be figuring it out for a long time. Mercy Corps' focus is, of course, as it should be, on implementing effective humanitarian programming in the field. And that means that we need to figure out how technology supports that, and not vice versa, right? Like, we don't do technology for the sake of doing it. We do it for the purpose of enhancing our programming and our ability to provide good programming. So I think a lot of it in terms of like management is one, leveraging tools that are sort of like force multipliers. And we'll talk about that, a little bit when we dig into what we've done on AWS. But the first thing is like, we cannot hire an AWS's worth of developers or data scientists, right? Like, we're not a corporate entity where we can just make all the investment we want. We're limited, right? Because we want to maximize the amount of money that's going to our programs and not spend that on overhead at the headquarters. Yep. And so, things like working with AWS to really identify like where are the places where we can spend a little bit of money to get a lot back in terms of how we manage tools and services to the field. We work really closely with our solutions architect to identify ways that we can leverage managed services without going over cost. What are the ways that we can consolidate requirements and sort of like build things together as opposed to recreating the wheel for every single country out there. So yeah, it's a tall order at times, but we are doing our best. But yeah, I mean, so I guess that brings us to sort of talking about our relationship with AWS. And so I mentioned that I was hired in 2020 to work specifically on an AWS grant. And so Amazon Web Services very generously gave us $1.6 million over the course of 3 years in order to like explore this idea of enabling data science through cloud technologies and enabling the use of quantitative information through cloud technologies. And so I came on basically to work under that grant and to work towards that goal. And so how did we kind of like go about that? As you were just kind of asking, how do we manage it? We sort of think about how we're doing this in 3 phases. The first is pilot, and then scale and architect. And when we talk about piloting, we really talk about, as I said, we don't do technology things for the sake of it. We do it to support humanitarian programming in some way. And sometimes that does mean like we have to kind of like ride along with teams and try to get them to understand how these technologies and methodologies can really support them. But in the end, like there has to be a decision or a choice or something that we're doing in order to do humanitarian aid better, in order for us to really like do a project on AWS or using data. And so sort of like really identifying those use cases and testing them out with individual countries is super important. Because that's where where the rubber meets the road. Like, does this output work for you? Does this output help you make a decision? If the answer is no, then we either need to change gears or we need to identify a new way of going about it or a new tool, right?
Yeah.
And so that's what we talk about when we talk about piloting, is like looking for those specific use cases that we think are valuable to our country teams.
Yep.
So
this is
sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, this is a nice arrow that I see, like pilot, scale, and architect. Do you ever find that it actually becomes a circle in a way, right? Architect, you always go back to like
totally.
Yeah.
So like, I mean, I think like sort of the scale and architect, maybe those are sort of our own personal definitions of them. But when we talk about scale, right, we look at things and we say, hey, you know, if it's applicable to this country, it might be applicable to the country next door, or it might be applicable to every country everywhere doing that type of programming, right?
Yeah.
So that's one thing around scale, but then architecting for scale, right? Like, how do we then build out the infrastructure that supports the use of this analysis across those many country contexts? And as you said, right, like sometimes then it becomes a bit of a circle. Like once you've got that infrastructure in place, it's sort of like not a difficult effort to then say, okay, and now we can bring it to the next country, and now we can bring it to the next country. I think it's not super often that a specific methodology can just be like broadly applied to everybody all the time, because all of these contexts are very nuanced and complicated and so forth. Right. But there are ways that we can sort of architect in order to make it easiest on ourselves to continue to do that scaling effort. And then to identify like new and creative ways to use data, and pilot something new and see if there's something else that we can add on or something else we can do that's interesting and unique. So yeah, one thing that we have piloted that we got started on like very early on in our AWS journey was forecasting the price of sort of like key commodities. And when I say key commodities, I mean like what are like the food goods and non-food items that are really important to folks in countries who may be in some sort of crisis. A lot of times when we see countries in complex crisis, right, they've got conflict going on somewhere, they've got natural disasters occurring, or climate change is creating, you know, impact. And what you end up with is big inflationary pressures. So prices go up, right? Your currency is devalued. And so that means people afford less and less. And that happens very rapidly. So month over month, however much money you have is worth less and less, and you can buy less and less. And so almost 50% of all Mercy Corps programming includes some sort of multi-purpose cash assistance. And in the humanitarian space, I think there's a sort of mental paradigm a lot of people have that we kind of like go out and we hand people bags of rice, or we hand people like packages of food. It's really not the case in most contexts. It does happen, usually in like extreme emergencies. Right. But for the most part, what the humanitarian community has found is that if you just give people money to buy what they need, they're going to spend it on what they need most. And that's usually things like food, shelter, medicine, you know, that kind of stuff. And so that's what we do, is we go out and we give people typically cash, just cash money, to buy their key goods.
So you mentioned here that there are a few scenarios where you do go and you do help these individuals. I heard climate change. I heard natural disasters, right? So natural disasters are sometimes, some people will say that they tie on to climate change, but for the sake of this, I'm thinking of this as split into two different scenarios. Sure. Right? So climate change maybe is a slower cause, and maybe it's easier to price out and forecast out how many funds you need, versus a natural disaster where it kind of happens suddenly. So how do you forecast for something that happens suddenly versus something that happens, over the cause of time?
It's a great question because I don't have an answer for you. So yeah, I mean, for price forecasting, primarily what we're looking at is countries in complex crises with like these like steady inflationary pressures. It is very, very difficult, I think, as a lot of people know, to forecast sort of the hockey stick effect, right? Like something happens and like that changes the dynamic on the ground.
Right.
And so that's certainly not a question that like Mercy Corps is going to figure out how to answer. There's a lot of like super smart academic people who are working on those problems 100% of the time. And what Mercy Corps is going to do is wait for one of them to fix that problem. And then we're going to take that and use it. A lot of times I think like, we go out into the world and we say, we need to build, we need to build, we need to build. I don't believe we need to build everything. There are tons of super smart people out there who spend their whole careers researching how to solve those problems. And what our job is to figure out how to translate those solutions into humanitarian action. And so sometimes that means doing a little bit of building on the end of that to make sure that the output makes sense to somebody who's programming, or packaging that output in some kind of platform that makes sense to humanitarians, right? Combining different sorts of information. So, but yeah, I don't know how you do it. Just that's your response. If anybody knows, please holler at me. But yeah, so we do try to focus on like those things that are a bit predictable. I think like in disaster response, what we look at, one way you can use price forecasting is look at a forecast and then look at how the prices are deviating from that forecast in real time. And that gives you an idea of the kind of impact that that event has had. And so that's one way that we can think about using these sorts of methodologies in disaster response, even if it's not like then forecasting, you know, how prices are going to look as the result of that disaster. So, yeah. So, yeah, just to like dive into the technicalities of it a little bit, we started out doing this in Syria. And one of the key things for us was like just rapidly sort of prototyping and figuring out like, how do we make this work for folks in the field? And so, you know, working with our solutions architect and exploring all these different services, we really identified Amazon Forecast as like a great tool because it provides that time series forecast. And in these like scenarios, you often have sort of this overwhelming inflationary pressure. And so that's very much a time series question. So we used Amazon Forecast to generate some initial results and kind of went through those results and realized that they would be like effective in terms of like looking at how the price is going to change more month over month for a group of like key food items. And then built a system around that does a couple of different things. Number one, it automatically gathers data and engineers it to the standard that we need. And we use almost exclusively Lambdas for data engineering. We used Glue very initially, but to be perfectly honest, humanitarian data is not really large enough to warrant the use of services that are like that aren't as lightweight as Lambda. Lambda is so easy, and AWS has a big free tier for Lambdas. And so for us, we do almost all our data engineering at very low or almost no cost by using this process. So we scrape data out of different APIs. And actually, we had to subscribe to a data source in order to do this analysis. And so we had an analyst just manually uploading data to S3 as well, and then bringing all those data sources together. And basically, when that data became available, that manual data became available, we would trigger an event bridge step function and go through the process of pre-processing the data, running a container to do pre-processing, run the forecast, post-process those, and using, again, like managed services like Fargate in order to do that. And we really, really dove deep into this idea of managed versus unmanaged services, because at the time, we only had like basically me working on AWS. And so like if your question is, and our solutions architect kind of posed the question to me, and he said, Alicia, how much do you want to manage this? And I said, I don't want to do any management. Yeah. And sort of like dove into that idea of managed versus unmanaged services, even though they're more expensive sort of per byte usage, like at the end of the day, I am not then managing this pipeline. It's sort of all up and running on its own, and I can just sort of monitor logs. And I can even get those alerts like coming into my email, so I don't have to worry as much about like what is happening within this application. And so this is a place where we really learned a lot about how the spectrum of AWS services can be a force multiplier for small organizations who just like don't have a huge tech capacity. And Mercy Corps is a large international organization, but our focus is not tech, and we don't have a huge tech team. So, so that's like a huge kind of like boon for organizations like Mercy Corps that are, one, trying to figure it out, and then two, just don't have the capacity or don't have the capacity yet to do as much as they would like to do.
Yeah.
Yeah.
A few things that you said that really stood out to me, and I know you said this sentence twice, and it really stuck with me. You said, we don't do technology for the technology's sake. We do technology for the humanitarian sake. And I think that really streamlines into everything that you just told me about how you want this architecture, this application to be self-managed, because Mercy Corps, we're not doing this for technology's sake. We want to make this the easiest way possible to get this platform up and running to serve our mission, right? And then another thing I wanted to bring up was you had no AWS experience 4 years ago. And here you are talking about all these different services and talking about managed services versus unmanaged services and looking at cost implications of the whole entire architecture. So I think that's all amazing. And those were the things that really stood out to me when you talked about this architecture here.
Yeah, it's a steep learning curve.
Yeah.
But I think, we were very fortunate in two things. Number one, like kind of having the partnership with AWS really giving us the latitude to try things and to fail, right? Because like at the end of the day, we could say like, here's what we tried, it didn't really work out. And then we could pivot and try something else, right? And we had a little bit of like financial backing. AWS also gave us some credits as part of this partnership. And so that really enabled us to like go out there and like, whoops, I blew $150 on forecast this month without like stressing over where that money's coming from. And so that was huge. And AWS has a lot of programs where organizations can have an innovative idea that they want to try. And AWS will often kind of like help out and sort of either whether that's through providing you some leadership mentorship through the solutions architects and your accounts manager, or like there's a number of different ways for nonprofit organizations to get free credits from AWS as well. And so those programs all really make it possible for you to go in and with like pretty limited budget or experience, like learn how to sandbox on AWS, learn what to do next, and figure out what's working for your organization. And we were very fortunate that AWS formalized a partnership with us and gave us that opportunity for sure. I personally am very fortunate because I was able to learn a lot, in relatively short amount of time.
That's awesome.
Anyways, this has all been overtaken by events because now there's 100 new products on AWS. It moves so fast. But this is a screenshot of sort of the output and sort of predicting. This looks like the price of bread in a shop. And you can see that in different geographies, the price in Syrian pounds changed in different ways over the course of time. This does include a predictive element. I think this was a pretty early visualization, but we kind of built a little dashboard app on top of the work that we were doing as well. And that enabled sort of the team to interact with those results and sort of figure out like what the next steps were. So what happened next was that Syria kind of like didn't have huge uptake. I think it was really early days. It was things we were trying out and just didn't kind of like get it into their program cycle or their decision-making cycle. But as that was happening, turns out there's a huge economic crisis in Lebanon, unfortunately. And as sort of the currency in Lebanon depreciated, the team there was really interested in the idea of like, how can we forecast prices? We're doing a lot of cash programming. And in order to like plan and understand like what's the real value of the US dollars that I'm giving people on the ground, you know, kind of looking at price forecasting was going to be a useful tool for them. If you sort of say, I'm going to give a family of 450 US dollars this month, but the next month the prices have changed and the currency has depreciated, right? Like that 150 US dollars is worth less once it gets to Lebanon. And so understanding those dynamics and understanding like, is the amount of money that we're providing them actually supporting them this month? That's an important thing to know, is to understand those transfer values. And so the team in Lebanon was really interested in this, and we sort of built a more sophisticated machine learning model in the background, and paired it with something called a pass-through effect, which is when you only consider the impact of inflation on the change in prices. So you kind of suss out that little component of it, and built out a tool where folks could be looking at sort of 6-month forecasts to plan their transfer values. And this is a tool that's also like heavily used for policy and advocacy. The humanitarian funding landscape has been contracting for a number of years. And so when you go to a donor and you say, like, this is the situation, this kind of tool is very, very powerful, because you can say something with a degree of confidence about what the future looks like for the people of Lebanon in 6 months, right? Whereas before we were kind of just describing, well, the situation's getting worse and it's probably going to continue to. And now we can kind of say how bad it's going to get. And so that becomes a very powerful tool in that respect.
Wow. So you're backing this up with data to go out and speak to your donors and say, so before, I'm just reiterating this so I hear this correctly. Before maybe communicating with your donors, you would say, hey, the situation is going to get pretty bad. But now you have this dashboard, you have the data to say, this is exactly, or we predict this is probably how bad it's going to get.
Yeah. We like to use the term forecast. I think prediction sometimes has like a connotation to it. And there's certainly uncertainty bounds around it. And there's a bit of a learning curve, I think, throughout the humanitarian community about dealing with the concept of uncertainty and so forth. But yeah, I mean, you can generally provide sort of like, well, this model is usually pretty accurate, and this is what it says the economy is going to do in the next 6 months. And that, you know, that speaks to donors because they can really justify an increase in funding. Or if they're not going to increase funding, like at least we know kind of what the situation is, you know, as we go along here. So, yeah. So, you know, that's kind of the price forecasting stuff is one thing, and we're continuing to look at like places and ways to scale that. And, but the real question is sort of like, what is the utility of data and data science across all of our outcome areas? And one of the things that we've struggled with, I think, over the last 4 years, as we've kind of been on this journey, is really digging into making sure that data products are speaking to the people that have to use that information. And I think oftentimes you'll go and you'll find public platforms that do something really cool with data science. But at the end of the day, it's not the output that a programmer needs. And so there's things like the granularity of the information. You might be able to forecast all kinds of different climate and weather variables, but if it's not on a scale that's small enough for a humanitarian to use, then there's not a lot that they can do with it from a programmatic perspective, right? We can broadly look at it. Maybe there's some policy and advocacy implications, but you can't say, this is how I'm going to change my programming based on this information, because it's too big. If you tell me what's going to happen in my country, that's not especially helpful if I'm implementing a program in a district, right? Like a county level. And you can imagine sort of, I live in Ramsey County, Minnesota. That's very different from some county in Alabama. And so speaking about the United States doesn't really help when you talk about things that impact my life personally. And it's the same concept here, right? Like if we're trying to impact somebody in a very specific county, it doesn't really help to have information about the country in terms of making those decisions. So we're really looking at like, what do we need to do? And so some of that is like a deep dive into things like remote sensing. Remote sensing is hugely valuable in the humanitarian sphere because obviously, if you have a country in conflict or other types of crisis, it can really limit your ability to go in and assess need. And so, for example, over the last year, we did an analysis on agricultural indicators in Sudan. Sudan has been in a civil war for over a year. It's very difficult to go into access to speak to people. And so we looked at remote sensing data to look at factors like soil moisture, rainfall, temperature, and try to forecast out the agricultural success of the year, right? We didn't go so far as to say this is how much we think they'll produce or whatever, but kind of just look at this is what we expect agriculture to do, all other things being equal. And so if I was going to choose where to implement agricultural programming, I might choose a place, that the indicators make sense, right? And in this case is basically if you want to do fertilizer drops to farmers, you want to do that in a place where water is not your limiting factor, because if you don't have water, like you're not going to have agriculture anyways. So we kind of looked at forecasting soil moisture and looked at places where soil moisture was going to be on par with average or higher. And that kind of targets in that way to do it. But then again, the output has to be useful. And the reality is there's a war going on in Sudan. And so qualitatively, we reported out as well. We worked with our global crisis analysis practice to report out on what they expected the conflict to do and what that actually means with respect to that analysis that we did. Maybe you're not going to be able to implement in those places because we expect the conflict to get there as well. And so I think, one of the things about the data science piece is being able to layer on qualitative information. And we're still kind of like working on that and what that looks like in practice and at scale. So we've done agriculture indicators. We're working right now on sort of, there's a drought in East Africa because of El Nino. El Nino affects everybody, I guess. And so kind of like looking at what that means for food security in East Africa. Things like mapping conflict and natural resources so that folks can explore like how are my peace and governance or mediation programs kind of, potentially being impacted by natural resources. Can we identify correlations to explore and then take the next step into deeper dives? And so one of the things we're looking at is really like, how do we identify those things that are going to be scalable and those things that we want to scale across outcome areas? And it's a struggle because we have a huge portfolio and a very diverse portfolio. So prioritizing certain things is going to be like very key.
When you say huge portfolio, does that mean like huge in size or huge
like
diversity?
Both, yeah. Like, so geographically, right, like 40 countries worldwide, that makes a huge difference if you're doing remote sensing and what those, agricultural factors mean and what that might look like. What does drought mean? What does, El Nino means something different to East Africa. It means something different to the Caribbean, and it means something different to Asia, right? It's affecting all those different places in different ways. And so that like diversity of problems, it's like, okay, like what do we want to hone in on? And I think right now we want to hone in on things that can be done with remote sensing because those are readily scalable. A lot of the data is public. Most of the public data has a high enough resolution to be useful. And we do a lot of work in food security, agriculture, and so forth. So there's a lot of utility there as well in terms of programming. So that's one of the places that we're focusing on now is really looking at how we can use remote sensing for humanitarian planning and so forth. Yeah,
this is all amazing. Just curiosity, do you think AWS plays any part in what comes next year for agriculture, drought security, all those?
I absolutely do. I think AWS and cloud technologies generally, right? Like if you think about our pilot scale architect model, we're kind of in a place with most of this right now where we're learning how to scale, right? We're learning how to reapply, replicate across multiple contexts. But in order to like really get into that architect phase, that's where I think cloud technologies really come in. Because the architect phase is really about, one, how do we use that data? How do we educate people within our organization on using that data? How do we integrate that data into our decision-making cycles? And where do we need to invest? And that's investing financially, but also investing human resources into building. And so, like, I think architecting for scale means we're looking at data management and infrastructure. So that's a really easy thing to think about how AWS plays into that, right? Like, where do those models live? How often do we generate them? How do we process the data? And how do we do that in a way that makes sense for us in terms of the cost and the management requirements? But I think a thing that folks don't think about as much that AWS does quite a lot of is sort of that literacy around technology as well, and sort of looking at AWS has a ton of free resources on like AWS Skill Builder. There's lots of sort of like YouTube influencers who help you build on AWS as well. And I think like one of the things within the humanitarian space or at large, not just at Mercy Corps, is helping humanitarians understand where this fits into how they do programming. I think there's a couple of different struggles there. One is people are experts in the context in which they work.
Yes.
And sometimes data is going to tell you something that you don't think makes sense or is contrary to your expertise. And that's a scary thing for people, not just in the humanitarian world, but everywhere, right? And the reality is that data will never replace expertise in humanitarian aid because of all those things that I talked about. Like, if you can analyze agricultural indicators, but like if the conflict's coming there, it doesn't really matter. And if we can't forecast where conflict is going to be, which really is very, very difficult,
Yes.
and I'm not sure that anybody's doing it, perfectly right now. If we can't do that, then we need to report out on that qualitatively, and we need to use our expertise and our knowledge. And likewise, we recently did an analysis on the El Nino drought and kind of where is most affected by it with respect to agriculture. And then the question was, but we know this other district that's not on your list of most affected districts has some strong vulnerabilities in their communities, right?
Right.
Whatever that reason is. And we said, well, then, yeah, like you should work there too, right? Like, don't just rely on what I've told you. Like, go and collect data in those vulnerable communities as well and decide, how you're going to prioritize. It doesn't have to be prioritized exclusively on data. And so like AWS helping us build that literacy around not just like data literacy, but data science literacy and how those results play into our decision cycles is super duper important, because otherwise we won't ever have uptake in our sector. And then the last thing, and I think this is a thing AWS also does that folks aren't necessarily aware of, but sort of like looking at what is our strategy around this architecting, and where do we invest first, and what do we need to invest first in, and how do we optimize? And you can really, like, especially as a nonprofit, there's a lot of resources available, even just like on the base level. Your accounts manager and your solutions architect will get with you and help you figure out how to make things happen on AWS. And I think like when we have strong organizational values, which we do at Mercy Corps, right? Like they are very attuned to understanding like, how can we make this work for you? And how does this fit into those organizational values? And so I think that's really where I see AWS playing into this is not just the infrastructure and building piece, which is a little bit more obvious, but data science and AI literacy, and helping to build out your strategy around those tools and services as well.
Wow, this has been amazing. I have one last question for you, and that's really, what's next for you, Alicia? You've had a great career. You've 4 years at Mercy Corps. What is next for you?
Yeah, so I think right now what we're doing is sort of like working on finalizing like what our broad strategy looks like around these tools. And so in 2022, I think, I could be wrong, we published a strategy, an organizational strategy called the Pathway to Possibility. And that's a 10-year strategy looking at broadly how Mercy Corps wants to operate in the world that we live in. And it calls out a few things around technology. One of it is we need to generate evidence, and we've just talked about how we're working on that. But if we want to generate evidence strategically, there's a lot that we need to start planning for. And so I'm excited to work sort of like at a strategic level, and really be part of that process of developing a strategy that fits within our organizational culture and values. I think there's also like a lot of hype around generative AI and like what can LLMs do for you, and we're starting to dig into that a bit. And I think that's both a really exciting and also a terrifying place for humanitarians to go, which also makes it very interesting. And so I'm excited to dig in a little bit more. We have a project actually that we're working with AWS on, using AWS Bedrock, and so hopefully the results will come out eventually and we'll be able to share those with you all. But yeah, so I'm excited to dig into that a little bit. And I think, I'm just interested to see where the world goes. It seems like there's a new challenge every day. Yeah. And I think we have a lot of creativity. And I also think, like I said, there's a lot of smart people working on big problems. And I think one of the things that I personally love about this job is that I don't have to build everything. Yeah. And I'm excited to see what somebody comes up with. And I'm excited to then see it put into practice. There's so much work being done that is just living in a GitHub repository collecting dust that we can pick up and we can put to use. And so, I'm excited to see where that goes. I think this is getting more and more attention, and data science is being applied more widely beyond sort of like corporate analysis and business analytics. And so there's a lot of smart people coming into this space. And so I'm excited to see what other people do and how we can use it at Mercy Corps.
Amazing. I've had a great conversation with you. I just want to say again, thank you, Alicia, for your time here. And this has been really helpful for me to understand your mission and really highlight more humanitarian work and nonprofit work on this platform. So again, I really want to thank you for your time. And there should be a place, hopefully we'll link out where your email is, or if people want to connect with you, there should be a place that they'll be able to connect. But again, thank you so much for your time. And I really appreciate it. And we here at AWS She Builds really appreciate your time.
Yeah, I know. I really appreciate this initiative, and it was great chatting with you. And yeah, we look forward to sharing what we do next with AWS.
Thank you. Take care.
Great. Cheers.
Awesome. That was so great. Like I love hearing these sorts of things. The comments in the chats were great. Hawks of Code, completely agree with what you're talking about there about measuring expectations of AI. My jam, ML ops, as a matter of fact. So right in line with me on the technology side of things. But I love that whole sentiment about like, we're not doing technology for the sake of technology. So what are they doing it for? They're doing it to improve the world. And I just love that. You get to do that every day, Han. I'm a little jealous. I don't know. What was your favorite part? What is your favorite part about that show?
Yeah, I think the part where it really stood out to me was that while the specific problems that Mercy Corps is facing in really delivering aid and development programs, Alicia was mentioning that they're across 40 different countries, right, around the world. And so the data that comes in are really uniquely complex. And there's a lot of analytical challenges that comes with that. So I do want to say that while the problems with Mercy Corps is specific for them, it's not a completely novel thing for nonprofit organizations. And it's not really a novel thing for many, even for-profit organizations, right? So companies and organizations of all sizes work with really diverse sets of data and a lot of data that they have to grapple and massage to get an actual answer for, right? So like I said, this is something that Mercy Corps really face, but it's not a novel thing within the industry to be using a lot of data and diverse sets of data. So yeah, just that was a part that really stood out to me watching this back again.
Yeah. It was super cool. I love getting to hear about these different approaches that people use. I'm also a big fan of managed services. Like, why do I want to mess with all of that stuff? Like,
Yeah.
manage some of this for me. Give me a Lambda all day. Yeah, so this was great. I love hosting shows with you. I love hearing more about nonprofit world and how we can do better. For those of you in the audience, thanks so much for your participation. Also, you can watch our previous episodes on our YouTube channel. Also, you can like and subscribe to our YouTube channel whenever you want. Watch us all the time. Like and subscribe, that whole thing.
Yes.
And then we also have a few upcoming episodes. So we'll have another show in a couple of weeks. Content is still TBD. We have one more customer episode for the year, and we are also getting ready to create I'm calling it the pre-invent episode. So what do you need to know to get ready for reInvent? You'll find me and a few of our other She Builds core team on that channel, on that episode. And we hope to see you again at reInvent on another episode of She Builds. Thanks so much for participating today. And Han, always great to see you.
Yeah, thanks, Candace. Thanks, everybody.
Right. Bye.